Greetings, brothers. What is happening? Today we're talking about red thirst. There's been a lot of talk about how it can be countered by like transhuman, and maybe it's not as strong as we think it is. So today I'm going to find out if it's legitimately good. We're going to look at successor traits. This should be a fun video. Thank you for being here. Let's get into it. So today's question, is the red thirst legitimately good? And if you don't know me, then I am John and I'm the Blood Angels Commander, and every week I try and do some sort of video that will help you and get more out of your Blood Angels on the tabletop. Sometimes we do hobbying, we also have battle reports. If that's something you'd want to consider watching on a weekly basis, then do consider subscribing and also hit that little notification bell so you get notified each time I either go live or we get a new video out. So let's get into this. Red thirst, legitimately good, yes or no? So there's like 4 points here we need to cover. They would be obviously, what is the red thirst? What are successor chapter choices that are similar? Let's compare some damage, because I always like to look at damage. We'll look at something like the Death Company, we'll look at the Sandguard, and then we'll look at some transhuman damage as well, because transhuman is the thing that seems to stump the red thirst. The red thirst obviously giving you +1 to wound, but when someone plays some sort of transhuman strat, and transhuman is just what I'm encompassing every rule that says like you cannot be wounded on like unmodified rolls of, it's usually 1, 2, or 3, sometimes it's 1 or 2, right? So basically it just makes it harder to wound, and this always supersedes the red thirst and essentially nullifies the +1 to wound we get out of it. And then let's talk about some final thoughts. So if you're not familiar with the red thirst, then you should be. It is the Blood Angels chapter tactic. It is going to give you +1 to all your advance and charge rolls, and it's also going to let you get to wound with +1 when you either charge, are charged, or perform a heroic intervention. So basically anytime a new model enters combat, you enter combat or someone enters combat with you, you're basically getting +1 to your attacks wound roll. The only time you're not getting that +1 is if the enemy heroic intervenes on you. Now this doesn't happen so often, and if you're a good player you can pretty much always prevent being heroically intervened on, so for the most time, every time a new combat happens, you're going to get +1 to your wound roll. So let's look at some successor chapters based on keeping the Blood Angels core identity, and essentially the core identity for Blood Angels is this hungry for battle. The advance and charge rolls get +1. 3 successor chapter traits that are interesting that will help one is Born Heroes. So each time you make a charge move, you get to add 1 to your hit roll. Tactical withdrawal makes you eligible to basically fall back and charge in the same turn. And Whirlwind of Rage is basically similar to Unleash Rage for the Blood Angels, in that each time you basically make the charge move, or charge, or do the heroic intervention, you would get to basically burst an additional hit on a roll of 6. It's worth noting that if you do cast Unleash Rage, then you would potentially burst 2 extra hits on every 6. And I've been up against that in a tournament. It's pretty rough, every 6 bursting into 2 extra hits, because 6s can obviously be swingy, so sometimes it can swing like a boatload extra attacks. So if we were going to build a Blood Angel successor chapter, then there's a few options here, right? One would be probably like, if you want to go pure damage, it would be Born Heroes and Whirlwind of Rage. So you're always getting +1 to hit, and you're always bursting 6s. The other one that would probably be interesting that we'll look at in this video is Tactical Withdrawal and Whirlwind of Rage. So basically you're bursting 6s, but you can fall back and charge. Now, Hungry for Battle is obviously core for Blood Angels. We're so used to getting that +1 to charge and advance. I don't think the +1 to advance is all that useful, but +1 to charge definitely can be useful. So let's get into this video. Let's have a look at the numbers, and then let's come back to these chapter tactics and see where we kind of land. So looking at the Death Company. So if you take 5 Death Company with Thunderhammers, and I'm going to hit a Leviathan Dreadnought. I did this a few weeks ago into Leviathan and just sort of used that as a difficult target to take down, right? With a 2-up save and Armor of Contempt, meaning if Thunderhammers are not in the Assault Doctrine, they're only -1. So 5 Thunderhammers is basically 20 hits, which basically equates to like, you know, you're going to attack 20 times, you're going to hit 10 times, you're going to wound 8.33 because of your +1 to wound. They're going to fail 2.75 saves, so they're going to do about 5.56 damage to a Leviathan Dreadnought, excluding Assault Doctrine. If you're not charging, right? So you wouldn't get +1 from shock tactics. You wouldn't get +1 from Black Rage. You only actually get 10 attacks, which would result in 5 hits. So you only do 2.2 damage. So you can see, I didn't actually realize how poor Death Company do you know, their damage is basically reduced to like 40% or something when they're not charging. So bear in mind, the Red Thirst doesn't help you at all when you're not charged, right? There's literally no +1 to wound. But all these other successor traits are basically the same. They all require you to be charging or being heroic intervening or being charged, right? So what if we take Born Heroes and Whirlwind of Rage and we use the same 5 Death Company and we keep them out of Assault Doctrine? This time we actually make 16.53 hits, which results in 10.9 wounds, which results in 3.6 failed saves, which is actually 30% more damage. So the Red Thirst against Born Heroes and Whirlwind of Rage, you're going to do 30% more damage. Bear in mind, you're going to give up your +1 to charge here, and I guess that's the defining factor. But when you're not charging, you actually have the exact same damage. It's identical to Red Thirst, right? So if we just do Whirlwind of Rage, because if we just pick Whirlwind of Rage and lose the Born Heroes, we could either take our +1 to charge like we talked about before, or we could take fall back and charge. So Whirlwind of Rage is maybe a more interesting comparison, right? You're basically, if you think of the Red Thirst as like one is a movement power, one is a damage power, this just, the purple that we've got here on the slide is just, you've just got a damage power. So if we're just bursting 6s, Whirlwind of Rage alone does 91% damage compared to the Red Thirst. So it's not bad, 91% of the damage, but it opens up some flexibility in that we could choose our movement power, right? When we're not charging, the damage is identical. Let's jump into Sanguinary Guard next. And don't worry if this is a lot, we're going to sum it all up at the end, so make sure you stick around for that. And if you do feel like you get some value out of today's video, I would love it if you would hit that like button. It really helps my videos grow, and I appreciate that so much. So 7 Sanguinary Guard with swords, this is the number people always say, 7 is optimal. We're going to use Assault Doctrine here, and we're going to fight an Armiger. So with the Red Thirst, we get 18.47 hits from the 28 attacks. We'd wound 9.24 times, because we wound on 4s. The Armiger's not saving very well against the -3 of the Sanguinary Guard swords, so we do 15.9 damage. When we're not charging, it's kind of half, 7.62 damage, right? Because we obviously get less attacks. It would actually just be like 21 attacks because there's no +1 to shock tactics, so it would be 21 attacks, shock assault, sorry, 21 attacks, which result in 13 hits, and it gives you 7.6. So if we compare that against the Born Heroes and Whirlwind of Rage, in fact, with the 28 attacks hitting on 2s, 6s bursting, you actually just essentially have 28 hits. But you only wound on 5s, so it would be 9.24 wounds, which if we compare is identical to the Red Thirst, so there's no difference in damage. The difference here would be the Red Thirst obviously gave you +1 to charge. If we're not charging, again, it's identical. Okay, so what if we just have Whirlwind of Rage, which opens up the ability to use that movement power? Well, again, it's all worked out here. You can check my math if you want. I'm not going to bore you anymore with it. It's 82% damage compared to the Red Thirst. So just having Whirlwind of Rage, just those exploding 6s and losing the +1 to wound, you only do 82% damage. So it was 91% damage before for the Death Company, 82% damage with the Sanguinary Guard. I guess if you do this across multiple units and multiple weapon types, there's going to be some variance. So these are just some ballpark figures to let you know what I'm thinking. Next up, let's talk about Transhuman, because this is the thing that we always talk about. This really counters Red Thirst, right? So if we did Assault Intercessors with Chainswords and we just hit basically into Blade Guard Veterans, they're 2 up, they've got no Armor of Contempt, so essentially they'd save on 3s. So 21 attacks without Assault Doctrine, they would do 2.28 damage. In the turn after, they'd get less attacks, obviously it would be like 16, so they'd do 1.74 damage. They would just be wounding on 4s because there's no +1, because essentially Blade Guard Veterans can transhuman, right? Sorry, skipped a slide. If we did the Born Heroes and the Whirlwind of Rage, we'd now be hitting on 2s rather than 3s, and we'd be bursting 6s. So your 21 attacks just essentially is 21 hits. We'd wound on the same 4s, which is 10.5 compared to 6.9. So suddenly we're doing 51% more damage than the Red Thirst here. So that's basically saying, like, if we're fighting into transhuman enemies, then we can expect a lot more damage from Born Heroes and Whirlwind of Rage. Obviously, if we're not charging, there is no difference. I basically wasted a bunch of time working out the no charging stuff. It happens. So it's good for the comparison. It makes it's useful, I suppose, to see that, like, you know, 3.46 basically halves again if you're not charging. Anyway, what about just Whirlwind of Rage? Well, with just Whirlwind of Rage against a transhuman target, you actually end up with 25% more damage. Because, I guess, you hit more often, which results in more wounds because you're only ever wounding on those 4s, right? Because of your unmodified... you can't wound on unmodified 1, 2, and 3. Again, the damage is similar in the non-charging, but so it's 25% more if you just have Whirlwind of Rage. So, think of it this way, right? Born Heroes is kind of a winner, right? But Whirlwind of Rage is behind against targets that don't have transhuman, but it's ahead against those transhuman targets. So that's kind of interesting. And I've got a bunch of thoughts on this. And hopefully this breaks it all down. So the Red Thirst, while it is a strong chapter tactic, we can agree on that, there's 2 real ways you counter it. 1 is transhuman type abilities. 2 is combats that last more than a single turn. And you saw the fall off. Blood Angels, the damage falls off crazy if you're stuck in combat. Transhuman obviously counters Red Thirst as well. I would say that there's maybe one other way that the Red Thirst struggles as well, and that's if the enemy make it harder for you to hit. Because if it's very difficult for you to hit, then the +1 to wound doesn't really help you at that point. So that's a semantic though, so I'm not really going to cover that in this video. I always say there's a decent amount of potential or amount of value in the +1 you get to advance and charge. However, we can take Sangre Ancient and he can take the Wrath of Baal, and this essentially is going to give all of our models within 6 +2 to their movement. So if you don't take the Wrath of Baal and you rely on the +1 to charge, if you do take the Wrath of Baal, you're kind of possibly in still a better state anyway. So part of the Red Thirst can be sort of offset by this Wrath of Baal. So let's talk about Born Heroes and Whirlwind of Rage. It did more damage with the Death Company, 30% more damage, 130 of the base. It did more damage with Assault Intercessors, 151% of the base. And it did the same damage with the Sangre Guard. Born Heroes in some ways would be less effective for the Sangre Guard if they're near a Warlord, because obviously the +1 to hit would essentially be countered. But Born Heroes Born Heroes with the Sangre Ancient's banner on a Death Company would actually give them +2 to hit, which offset the -1 to hit, which would be Death Company would hit on 2s and burst on 6s, which is pretty crazy considering Death Company usually rely on Chapter Master and stuff. They could potentially, you could set up two Forlorn Furies. You know, you could put the Ancient and one Death Company on one flank, you could put a Chapter Master and a Death Company on the other flank, and now you've got 2 super hard hitting Death Company and the enemy don't know which one's jumping forward, right? Both of them are going to do a ton of damage, because one will be hitting on 3s, because of the +1, bursting 6s, re-rolling everything. One will be hitting on 2s, bursting 6s, no re-rolls. So Whirlwind of Rage was behind in 91% when we compare it to the Red Thirst, 82% for the Sangre Guard, but then 125% for Transhuman. Obviously, just Whirlwind of Rage is the most flexible, as it lets you pick either that Hungry for Battle, which is essentially our +1 to advance and charge, or Tactical Withdrawal, which is fall back and charge. And I think Tactical Withdrawal is the thing that I want to talk about in this next slide. So if you don't run any named Blood Angels characters, and you want to run a Chaplain, who could take Canticle of Hate, or you potentially want to run an Icon of the Angel, and if you just want maximum damage, then I guess Born Heroes and Whirlwind of Rage seems like it's possibly a better choice than the Red Thirst. I mean, your Assault Intercessors did more damage, the Death Company did more damage, and I think there's definitely going to be some situations there where the Sangre Guard could do more damage as well, because you're going to make a lot more hits. It's maybe not quite as great on the Sangre Guard, but if you burst a load of 6s, it could be really good, right? Because obviously any re-rolls you do as well have a chance to re-roll into 6. So if you've got any sort of Chapter Master around there and you're re-rolling a bunch of 1s and 2s or something, and there's a chance that they re-roll a 6, that's essentially extra hits as well. So I haven't factored in those extra hit re-rolls, but it is something that you have to keep in mind. If you re-roll a dice, then there is a 16% chance that that becomes a hit on a 6 and burst an additional 1, right? However, the thing that is most interesting to me I think, is the drop-off in damage when not getting the charge bonus, right? So, like, with the Red Thirst, the Death Company go from 5.56 to 2.2, so they lose 60% of their damage if they're stuck in combat for an additional round. Sanguinary Guard go from 15.93 to 7.6, so they lose 50% of their damage, and the Assault Intercessors, in the situation that we had there, they lose like 25% of their damage. So there's a huge fall off, and arguably this fall off will be even more when you were in the Assault Doctrine, because in the Assault Doctrine you would be getting +1 additional attack, simply because of Savage Echoes, right? So my thought was like, what about Whirlwind of Rage? Because if you fall back, obviously the enemy can cut you down, and potentially you can take mortals, but in reality not that many people cut you down, and cut you down is a weird one in that the model has to be engagement range. So sometimes if you think of like a squad of guys where like you've got 3 guys up front and 2 behind, cut them down for 1 CP is only 3 chances. You can only roll it for the model's engagement range. So it's 5-man squad with 3 in combat and 2 behind within half an inch so they can fight. You're only rolling 3 dice, you're fishing for 6s, you're potentially doing 1 mortal wound. Cut Me Down doesn't get a lot of play. The only time Cut Me Down gets play is if you've got like 1 model with 1 wound left and it's falling out of combat, because it feels like it's worth trying to fish for the 6 to wipe the squad. Most of the time beyond that, Cut Them Down doesn't get played. So if the Death Company had fallen back, but they can recharge with Whirlwind of Rage, then they do 130% more damage than the 2.2 that is left. I have to think about that again for a second. Yeah, so potentially they do 230% of this damage, 130% more than the Red Thirst figure. So if you fought with the Death Company, fell them back, and charged again, then you're doing 130% more damage than remaining in combat. With the Sanguinary Guard, you're only doing 66%, so it would essentially be 166, but 66% more than the 7.6. And then the Assault Intercessors, it's 64%. So like when you think of it that way, and there is situations like, let's say you are charged by the enemy, and this is the one that creeps to mind. So if I'm charged, the opponent fights me first, and then I fight back. But then my turn, they're going to get to fight again before I can fight, right? So they fight twice, and I've only fought once. Whereas if you had Tactical Withdrawal, they would fight once, I would fight with like my weakened profile, then I would fall back and I would charge with my stronger profile. So like, that begs the question, how often are you stuck in combat for multiple turns versus how valuable is +1 to your charge roll? And this is the $1 million question, right? Because like, the +1 to charge roll has helped me in a bunch of games. But I don't always prioritize like Wrath of Baal and Icon of the Angel. But I could if I knew I didn't have +1 to charge, Canticle of Hate as well, potentially. How often am I stuck in combat for multiple turns? A lot. And how often do my units stuck in combat for multiple turns don't do enough damage? A lot, right? Like that happens to me quite often against anything with like really high toughness. I feel like it happens because we know Sanguinary Guard or Transhuman, I guess Transhuman would be another one it happens against. Like if you're against an enemy that has a ton of -1 damage in Transhuman, then Sanguinary Guard are really ineffective. So being able to fall back and do basically 66% more damage than the 7.62 seems really interesting. And remember, like I said, if you're falling back, if you had Savage Echoes on top of this, that puts these numbers up like considerably as well. So like, I kind of wish I'd done that now. So did I actually mock that up and just add the extra attacks you would get from Assault Doctor in here? I didn't change the AP because I guess that would break things, because too many variables. But by adding those extra attacks from Assault Doctrine, it actually says it would be 120% more damage compared to the Red Thirst sticking in combat for another turn. So, you know, you're charged with a squad of Sanguinary Guard. Let's say by some miracle they do no damage to you. You do 7.62 back. As it currently stands as a Blood Angel, they will then fight you again. Maybe they'll do some damage this time, and then you have to do your 7.6 back. If you had Whirlwind of Rage, They charge you, you survived, you did your 7.6 back, you now fall back and you charge again for 16.26 damage. It's a valid question. I mean, like, I like the +1 to wound, I like the +1 to charge, I like being a Blood Angel, and you guys know that at the moment Mephiston is one of my go-to characters, but is there a valid Successor Chapter in here? Fall back and charge on Blood Angels with Whirlwind of Rage. This seems interesting. So that is this week's video. Tell me, guys, is anyone considering Born Heroes Whirlwind of Rage? Is anyone thinking Tactical Withdrawal Whirlwind of Rage? Leave me that in the comments down below. While Red Thirst is a brilliant chapter tactic, and I've been playing with it for years now, and I kind of love it. The problem, though, really is that there's not that many, like, I guess they're called chapter tactics for Marines, but like for like Votann, they would be your League, or for Tyranids, they would be like your God Tyranids. Of course, it's the High Fleet. Not many of these sort of like defining army traits can be countered, right? But the Blood Angels one can be. Maybe if the ruling was changed, Red Thirst +1 somehow interacted with that transhuman, but because it doesn't, it's an interesting one. The purists, I guess, will continue to run Blood Angels. I will continue to run whatever I think I can win tournaments with, because I think at the moment we have to snatch every opportunity that we can get, because we really only have a couple of competitive units in our codex. That was discussed last week. You can check that video out if you want. I'll link it up above. I hope you enjoyed this video. I really do appreciate you watching to the end. Hit the like button, think about subscribing, and I will catch you in the next video. I also have a GT coming up this weekend, so wish me luck. My first game is against Sisters of Battle, and it's a list that has beaten me a bunch of times. So that's going to be a fun one. I'll let you know how that goes. I'll try and take some photos. I'll try and share everything. And I will catch you next week, guys. By the blood army made strong. Peace.